The most terrifying thing about a monster isn't the way it looks in the dark, but the way it smiles at you across a candlelit dinner table while holding a steak knife. I remember the exact smell of that room, a suffocating mixture of expensive mahogany polish, expensive red wine, and the iron-scented fear that had lived in my marrow since I was 5 years old. I was 32 now, a mother myself, and yet, sitting in that high-backed velvet chair, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. My daughter Lily sat next to me, her small legs dangling, her eyes wide as she watched her cousin, Leo, pile his plate high with thick, juicy cuts of ribeye. My father, the patriarch of a family built on silent compliance and loud judgments, cut into his own steak with surgical precision. The silver of his fork glinted under the chandelier, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic scraping of metal against porcelain. It was a sound that usually meant, "Stay quiet," but Lily hadn't learned that language yet. She looked down at her own plate, a small chip saucer piled with the gray, discarded fat and cold gristle that my mother had saved from the kitchen prep. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thread in the heavy silence. "How come Leo gets the good meat and I only get the scraps?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on our chests. Have you ever felt a moment where the air simply vanishes from a room, leaving you gasping for a breath that won't come? I felt my pulse thundering in my throat as my father's hand stopped moving. He didn't look up immediately. He just let the question hang there, rotting in the air. Then he leaned back, his leather chair creaking like a warning, and he let out a laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a cold, hollow bark, the kind of sound a hunter makes when he realizes the prey has finally walked into the trap. "Some people in this world earn the finer things, Lily," he said, his voice as sharp as the blade he was still holding. "And some people are just lucky to be at the table at all. You haven't earned a steak. You're lucky you aren't eating on the floor." He looked at me then, his eyes like two pieces of flint, waiting for me to apologize for her, waiting for me to shush my 4-year-old and tell her to be grateful for the garbage on her plate. But my daughter didn't know the rules of this twisted game. She only knew that her stomach was empty and the man she was supposed to call Grandpa was looking at her like she was a stain on the rug. "But I'm hungry," she said, her lower lip beginning to tremble. That was the spark. That was the moment the tension we had been living under for decades finally reached its breaking point. My father didn't just get angry, he detonated. He slammed his open palm against the table so hard the wine glasses jumped and shattered, red liquid bleeding across the white lace tablecloth like a fresh wound. My mother, ever the loyal shadow, hissed under her breath, a sound of pure venom directed at me before she grabbed Lily's plate and shoved it so violently toward the girl that the cold scraps flew onto her lap. "Eat what you're given and be silent." My mother barked, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated cruelty I hadn't seen since my own childhood. Lily started to cry. Not a loud, demanding wail, but a soft, terrified whimper that tore through my heart like a serrated blade. I saw her tiny hands shaking as she tried to pick up a piece of the cold fat. I saw the way she looked at me, pleading for me to do something, to be the mother I had promised I would be. And in that split second, something that had been frozen inside of me for 30 years finally shattered. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just moved. I scooped her up out of that chair, her small body vibrating with terror, and I didn't look back. I heard my father's chair fly backward. I heard his roar of, "Get back here and teach this brat some respect." But I was already at the door. I didn't even grab my coat. I just ran into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap of reality. But I wasn't fast enough. As I reached the porch, I felt a hand snag my shoulder, spinning me around. It wasn't my father. It was my mother, her eyes bulging, her fingers digging into my skin like talons. "You don't leave this house until your father says so," she hissed. In the chaos, in the shadows of the porch, I saw my father looming behind her. He wasn't empty-handed. He had been fixing the loose floorboard earlier that day, and the heavy, steel-headed hammer was still gripped in his white-knuckled fist. He didn't swing it at me, not yet, but he slammed it into the doorframe right next to Lily's head to stop us from moving. The sound was deafening, a crack like a gunshot that sent splinters of wood flying. Lily screamed, a sound of pure agony, and as I looked down, I saw the blood. Her tiny finger had been caught between the hammer's vibration and the wood. How do you describe the feeling of watching your child bleed because of the people who gave you life? It's a sickness that starts in your stomach and turns your entire world black. I didn't stay to argue. I pushed past my mother with a strength I didn't know I possessed, stumbling toward my car as the yelling followed us down the driveway. By the time I reached the hospital emergency room, the adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. The ER smelled like burnt coffee and the kind of industrial cleaner that tries to mask the scent of human misery. I sat on a plastic chair that felt like ice, holding Lily against my chest while she sobbed into my shirt. Her hand was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, a kitchen towel I'd grabbed on the way out, now soaked in deep, dark crimson. When the nurse finally called us back, her expression shifted the moment she saw Lily's hand. It wasn't just a cut. Her fingernail was gone and the bone beneath was bruised and swollen. "How did this happen?" the nurse asked, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp, scanning my face for the lies she was used to hearing. "My father," I whispered. The word felt like a confession of a sin I hadn't committed. He was angry. He had a hammer. He missed me and hit the door. She was in the way. The nurse didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly and stepped out of the room. A few minutes later, 2 men in uniforms appeared at the door. They weren't doctors. They were police officers, their belts jingling with the weight of authority, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to hide. I didn't feel the need to protect the Grant family name. I looked at those officers, and then I looked at my daughter, who was staring at her bandaged hand like it was a monster that had betrayed her. "Mommy, did I do something bad?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital machines. That question, it was the final nail in the coffin of my old life. Why is it that the victims always feel the most shame? Why was my 4-year-old asking if she was the reason her world had turned into a nightmare of blood and hammers? I knelt down beside the bed, ignoring the officers for a second, and I took her tiny, uninjured hand in mine. "No, Lily, you were the only person in that house who was doing something good. You were telling the truth. And from now on, that's all we're ever going to do." I stood up and turned to the officers. The taller one, a man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, pulled out a small black notebook. "Miss Grant," he said, "can you start from the beginning? Don't leave anything out. Not the dinner, not the scraps, and certainly not the hammer." I took a deep breath. I told him everything. I told him about the years of being told I was less than. I told him about the way my mother would give the best of everything to my brother's children while Lily was treated like an intruder. I told him about the discipline that always felt a lot more like a slow-motion assault on a child's spirit. As I spoke, the officer's pen never stopped moving. The scratching sound was different this time. It wasn't the sound of my father's fork against a plate. It was the sound of a record being built. It was the sound of a trap finally snapping shut on the people who thought they were untouchable. If you've ever had to stand up to someone who was supposed to love you, you know the weight of that silence. It's heavy, it's terrifying, and it feels like you're jumping off a cliff without a parachute. Stay with me, because what I found out later that night changed the trajectory of my entire life. The officer, whose name tag read Miller, stepped out to take a call, leaving me alone with the quiet beeping of the monitors. My phone, which had been silent in my pocket, suddenly began to vibrate. It was a frantic, aggressive buzzing. I pulled it out and saw my father's name flashing on the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't let the fear win this time. I answered. "What did you tell them?" His voice boomed, skipping any pretense of concern. He didn't ask if Lily was okay. He didn't ask if she needed surgery. He only cared about the narrative. "I told them the truth, Dad," I said, and my own voice sounded strange to my ears, steady, cold, and entirely unfamiliar. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he snarled. I could hear him pacing on the other end, the sound of his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. "Kids cry. Accidents happen. Your mother says you were being hysterical, just like when you were a girl. You always loved the drama, didn't you? Making us look like the villains because you couldn't follow a simple rule." In the background, I heard my mother's voice, sharp and thin. "She was always a difficult child, George, ungrateful, after everything we gave her." I leaned my head against the cold hospital wall and closed my eyes. For 30 years, those voices had been the internal soundtrack of my life. They were the reason I apologized for existing. They were the reason I let them treat my daughter like a second-class citizen. They had convinced me that their cruelty was actually love and that my pain was just ingratitude. But as I looked at Lily, now sleeping fitfully under the fluorescent lights, I realized they weren't powerful. They were just small, scared people who needed someone to look down on so they could feel tall. "Dad," I said, interrupting his rant. "The police are already on their way to the house. I gave them a full statement. I told them about the hammer. I told them about the stake. I told them everything. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a man who had finally run out of threats. He hung up without another word. Officer Miller walked back in a few minutes later, his face grim. "We sent a unit to the residence," he said. "Your father tried to tell them it was a teaching moment that went wrong. He said the hammer was just a prop he was using to make a point about safety. Your mother backed him up, of course." "Of course she did," I whispered. "But here's the thing, Miss Grant," Miller said, leaning in. "Your father isn't as smart as he thinks he is. He tried to hide the hammer in the garage, but he didn't realize there was blood on the doorframe, and he didn't realize that we took photos of the dinner table before they could clean it up. He flipped his phone around and showed me a picture. It was a shot of the dining room. There, in the center of the frame, was the beautiful, expensive table. On one side, a plate with a half-eaten, succulent steak. On the other, the tiny chip saucer with the cold fat and gristle, the scraps that had started it all. It was a visual map of their cruelty. "The DA is going to love this," Miller said. "This isn't just an accident. This is a pattern of emotional and physical abuse. And that hammer? That's a deadly weapon." The next 3 days were a blur of social workers, lawyers, and the kind of soul-crushing paperwork that follows a family's implosion. I didn't go back to their house. I stayed with a friend, keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn. Lily was quiet, too quiet. She spent most of her time staring at her bandaged hand, her eyes losing that spark of childhood curiosity that I had fought so hard to protect. We had to return to the neighborhood once just to pick up some of our things while the police were there to supervise. Standing at the edge of that driveway, the house looked different. It didn't look like a mansion anymore. It looked like a tomb. Yellow police tape was stretched across the front gate, a garish plastic reminder that the Grant estate was now a crime scene. My father came out onto the porch as I was loading a suitcase into my trunk. He looked older. His hair was disheveled, and the expensive silk shirt he was wearing was wrinkled. For the first time, he didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who was finally realizing that his kingdom was made of sand. "You really did this?" he called out, his voice cracking. "You destroyed this family over a piece of meat?" I stopped. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I felt a strange sense of pity. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about the steak. He thought this was about a dinner. He didn't understand that the steak was just the final symptom of a cancer that had been eating us alive for decades. "I didn't destroy this family, Dad," I said, my voice carrying across the lawn. "You did. You destroyed it every time you chose cruelty over compassion. You destroyed it every time you made me feel like I had to earn the right to be loved. I'm just the one who finally stopped pretending it was okay." Beside him, my mother appeared in the doorway. She didn't say a word. She just stared at me with a look of pure, concentrated hatred. It was the same look she used to give me when I would cry as a child. It was the look that told me my pain was an inconvenience to her comfort. I didn't look away this time. I let her see that her power was gone. I let her see that she couldn't hurt me anymore because I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was Lily's mother. Desire for control whispers louder than guilt, but the truth screams louder than both. The day of the hearing arrived with a cold, gray sky that matched the mood of the courthouse. The building felt like a fortress of accountability, its stone walls and high ceilings designed to make people feel small. But as I walked through those heavy oak doors, I didn't feel small. I felt solid. I felt grounded. Lily was with me, holding my hand with her uninjured one. She was wearing her favorite dress, the one with the yellow sunflowers, and she was carrying a notebook. While we waited on the long wooden bench outside the courtroom, she began to draw. I watched her hand move across the page, creating a sun with long golden rays and two stick figures standing in a field of green. "Who's that, honey?" I asked softly. "It's us," she said, not looking up. "We're in the sun now because there are no hammers there." I had to swallow hard to keep from crying. A 4-year-old should never have to think about hammers when she thinks about her family. Across the hall, my parents arrived with their high-priced attorney. My father was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. He walked with a forced confidence, nodding to people he knew, trying to play the part of the respected businessman who was being falsely accused by a disturbed daughter. My mother followed behind him, her chin tucked into her fur collar, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. They didn't look at us. Not at first. But when the clerk called Isabella Grant, my father's gaze snapped to mine. For a fleeting second, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. Not the fear of a victim, but the fear of a bully who realizes his victim has grown bigger than him. He opened his mouth as if to say something, maybe a final threat, maybe a plea for mercy disguised as an order, but the courtroom door swung open and the moment passed. The room was deathly quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the shuffle of the judge's robes as she took the bench. Judge Henderson was a woman who looked like she didn't have time for fairy tales. She looked at the evidence photos, the scraps on the saucer, the blood on the doorframe, the hammer, with a face that remained unreadable. When it was my turn to take the stand, the walk to the witness box felt like a mile. I sat down and looked out at the room. I saw my father sitting at the defense table, his hands clenched. I saw my mother looking at her nails as if she were bored. And then, I saw Lily. She was sitting with the social worker in the back row, her little legs swinging, her eyes fixed on me. "Tell us about the evening of the 14th, the prosecutor said. I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the judge, and I told the story. I told it without the shakiness I expected. I described the way the air felt in that room. I described the way my father's laughter felt like a physical blow. I told them about the steak and scraps policy that had been a tradition in that house for as long as I could remember. And why did you feel it was necessary to flee the house that night?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I realized that if I stayed, I wasn't just letting them hurt me," I said, my voice ringing clear in the silent room. I was teaching my daughter that she deserved to be hurt. I was teaching her that love has conditions, and that those conditions are often cruel. I had to leave to show her that she is worth more than the scraps they were willing to give her. My father's attorney tried to paint me as a bitter woman looking for a payday. He tried to claim that the injury was a freak accident during a standard disciplinary moment. He even tried to suggest that I had caused the injury myself to frame my father. But then the prosecutor played the recording of the phone call my father had made to me at the hospital. The sound of his voice, booming, angry, dismissive, filled the courtroom. "You're blowing this out of proportion. Kids cry. That's what they do." The judge's expression finally shifted. Her eyebrows drew together and she looked at my father with a cold, clinical intensity. That recording was the final piece of the puzzle. It showed his lack of remorse. It showed his arrogance. It showed the truth that no expensive suit could hide. When the judge finally spoke, her words were like a gavel hitting a stone. "This court finds a clear and present pattern of emotional and physical endangerment. Discipline is not a hammer swung in anger. Respect is not something you demand by starving a child of the same food you eat in front of them." The ruling was swift and devastating. My parents were given a restraining order. My father was ordered to undergo anger management and face criminal charges for the assault. My mother was cited for neglect. But more importantly, the court granted me full, unsupervised custody with no contact allowed for my parents until a full psychological evaluation was completed, and even then, it would be under the strictest supervision. As we walked out of that courtroom, my father tried to stop me one last time. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his face purple with rage. "You'll have nothing. No inheritance, no support, no family." I stopped and looked him right in the eye. "I already had nothing when I was with you, Dad," I said. "Now, for the first time in my life, I actually have everything." I took Lily's hand and we walked out into the sunlight. Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable, but freedom makes them unnecessary. We moved to a new apartment in a different city, a place where the air felt lighter, and the walls didn't hold any old ghosts. Our kitchen table is small, but it's ours, and every night we eat the same thing. If I'm having steak, Lily is having steak. If I'm having a sandwich, she's having a sandwich. There are no good parts and scraps here. Lily's finger healed, though there's a small faint scar that remains, a tiny white line that serves as a reminder of the night the cycle finally broke. She doesn't draw hammers anymore. Now she draws gardens and houses with open doors and people who are always holding hands. The journey wasn't easy. There were nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, hearing my father's voice in my head telling me I was a failure. There were days when the guilt of destroying my parents' lives threatened to swallow me whole. But then I would look at Lily, happy, healthy, and unafraid, and I would remember that I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped participating in a lie. I realized that the greatest gift you can give your children isn't an inheritance or a big house or a good family name. It's the truth. It's the knowledge that they are worthy of respect, that their voice matters, and that they never, ever have to settle for the scraps of someone else's love. If this story reminded you that your voice has power, hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of people who finally found the courage to speak up. because sometimes the only way to save your future is to walk away from the people who are trying to trap you in their past.